yet they kept too much for the people that didn't like it. So it's a very, very unsatisfactory result.
Well, I think we should make a go of it. So, Phil, will you kick us
Oh, I
off with
can't
a little
wait.
gathering prayer?
Sure. So we place ourselves always as two or three are gathered in God's holy name, and we remember in a very special way Neil Conley, who helped inspire us, that he and all the saints are there with us, united in prayer, as we continue to live Jesus in our own way, through art, through design, and through the theology of beauty that surrounds us. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So just so we all know who Daniel is for us tonight, we know he's at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, and his classes focus on the Catholic intellectual tradition, Catholic culture in the 20th century. I love this parentheses, Daniel, Springsteen, Scorsese, and SHU. I want to take that class. And the intersection of Catholicism and American political life. Not that we have a lot to say there. His first book, Recognizing the Gift, appeared in 2016, and he writes in academic venues as well as at Sacred Heart's Go Rebuild My House blog. So, Daniel, we are all so excited to hear your presentation on Who's Punching Bag. So, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane, and thanks to all of you for coming, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this. So, pivoting off of what Jane just said in her introduction, so this work, before I start my slideshow and really get into the presentation, and again, as I was saying before it started, this will be interactive. I'm not going to lecture at you for 45 minutes. We'll probably skip over a few slides and everything, which is fine. I'm always happy to send it on if you have enough bandwidth for the amount of images that I have in this thing. But this comes out of my teaching, this work. So I teach a class, as Jane was saying, called Springsteen, Scorsese, and SHU, about Catholicism and culture. So Sacred Heart University, for those of you not familiar, I don't know how much Tony talks about Sacred Heart in his homilies and all this, right? But Sacred Heart was founded in 1963. So it's a relatively young Catholic university. It was founded with Vatican II in mind, really to be a lay institution. It's always had a lay president. It used to be more of a diocesan institution. But so when it came time to come up with an elective for our Catholic Studies department, I thought, what if I focus something around the time of our school's founding and different kind of currents in the Catholic imagination in that period. And so the idea of a Catholic imagination comes originally from one of my teachers, David Tracy at the University of Chicago. And it's really this idea of the way that Catholic culture, Catholic intellectual life, Catholic sacramentality manifest forward in all these different areas beyond just kind of theology, in art, film, literature. And so in that class, we talk about a lot of things centering around kind of the 60s. We talk about film, we go back to the 50s and talk about On the Waterfront. We use some of my other former teacher at Fordham. Jim Fisher has a great book on the Waterfront and the Chelsea Piers in the 50s and the Irish waterfront. And we of course do talk about Springsteen. We talk about music and films. We do the Godfather films. We do a number of Scorsese films. And in the middle of all that, one of the things we do is talk about Andy Warhol, who fits really well on several levels into this, as we'll talk about. And it so happened the first year I taught this class was the year they had that great Warhol retrospective at the Whitney. And so I was able to actually take about 10 of the students from that class to that exhibit as part of the class. So that was a great trip and a great way for them to kind of, a lot of them told me after going to the exhibit that it really changed their perspective on the art to go see it, especially some of the works we won't be talking about today. Some of Warhol's very shocking works in the Death and Disaster series make a lot more sense if you see them in person than if you just see a slide of a picture of an electric chair, right? It seems kind of weird. This work comes out of that. And more recently, I've become interested in drawing out some of the connections between Warhol and Basquiat. because one of the pieces of art that always struck students the most was the piece of art we're going to really be focusing on in this talk, which is 10 Punching Bags, one of the collaborations between Warhol and Basquiat. And so I've become increasingly interested in that collaboration and the way the Catholic imagination plays out for the two of them. So with that, I will start my slideshow so we can really kind of get into the meat of this and think about these two very unique artists who had a really deep collaboration, one that meant a lot to Basquiat in particular, as we'll talk about when we get to his biography. Warhol's death precipitated Basquiat's death. But so I've entitled this talk, Who's Punching Bag? Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat's collaboration and the Catholic imagination as it plays out between the two of them. So I have on my opening slide two of their more kind of famous, emblematic types of works, but I really want to start with the work we're going to center on. And I want to just take a moment and ponder. So this is 4 of the 10 punching bags. And this was taken in a museum on display. So you can see another work behind it, which we'll talk about, we'll see later. But I just do want to stop and pause and react. What is going on here in these punching bags? What is this?
Wow.
The word that comes to my mind is anger.
I'm intrigued by the word judge.
Yeah, any other thoughts? Who's on the go ahead.
It's certainly, I mean, it certainly look, it is Jesus in the middle of it all.
Mm-hmm.
But who are the judges that are in this?
Or maybe it's a commentary on, it's another thought, just a commentary on the fact that we often view religion and Jesus as someone who judges us rather than someone who saves us and loves us. I don't know. I always thought of Basquiat as someone who was, in a good sense, a counter-revolutionary or a revolutionary, I should say. And it's like this notion of juxtaposing ideas, accepted ideas.
This is all really good. This is a really this is a really unique work of art, really, in both Warhol and Basquiat's oeuvres, as we'll talk about. And I like to do this opening exercise where we just think a little bit about our reactions, because I think it is so jarring, right? We have Jesus on punching bags, and then a bunch of things drawn on top of him, right? And again, this word judge. So there's a lot of things for us to take in here, right? But this is my students have always found this to be a striking and really unusual work of art. And it's not a work of art, as we'll talk about, that gets displayed a lot. Although this summer it will be on display at Pittsburgh. We'll talk about that at the end. So, but and again, note there is another Warhol work that we'll be seeing later behind here. So let's jump in a little bit and think about who we're dealing with here. Well, besides Jesus, we'll come back to him too. But so let's talk a little bit about Warhol. there's a lot I could say about Andy Warhol, and we're not going to get into most of it. But he is one of, if not the most important American artists of the 20th century. He's born in Pittsburgh, and his upbringing in Pittsburgh and the particularities of his upbringing in Pittsburgh in a Slovak Eastern Catholic community are extremely important to his work, not least to what we're going to be talking about tonight. And then he lives his adult life in New York. Quite a bit of it on the Upper East Side, in fact. Several of his studios are there. Later lives down near kind of Sutton Place. And he works in various genres, right? He gets to start in advertising, as many pop artists got their start in commercial art. He does video, very kind of unusual, sometimes quite shocking movies, record album covers, famously the Velvet Underground and Nico, as well as the Rolling Stones, Sticky Fingers. And he coins the term 15 minutes of fame, saying that someday everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. So there's all sorts of things that could be said about Warhol, and I'm not going to try to rehearse all of them. And in fact, except for the opening slide that had a Campbell's soup can, we're not going to be looking tonight particularly at Warhol's iconic works. The things that if anybody knows a little bit about Andy Warhol that jump out, the Brillo boxes, even the portraits. We're going to be in a sort of unusual and relatively late part of Warhol's oeuvre in terms of what we're going to be talking about tonight, because he takes a religious turn in his work very late in his life, which is very interesting, and which our conversation tonight kind of fits into. So, Eastern Catholicism. So Andy Warhol was born Andrew Warhola to Slovak parents. So it's a Ruthenian Catholic family. This is his church here in Pittsburgh. You can still go there. They are Byzantine Catholics, right? So they are Catholics who worship according to the Eastern rites. So according to the same kind of liturgical rites that Eastern Orthodox Christians do. So their worship practices are quite different from Roman Catholic worship practices. I mean, they're family resemblance. The Eucharist is the Eucharist, right? But the way that it plays out is quite distinct, develops on a parallel trajectory. Their churches are typically covered in icons. So you see all these flat icons here, right? Very typical of that tradition. They have a married clergy, right? So again, it's a very distinct tradition, but within Catholicism, broadly speaking. And Warhol remains attached to this tradition in various ways throughout his life. He is someone who remains Catholic. I sometimes refer to him as kind of openly gay and closeted Catholic, because that was kind of some of how this played out in his life. I mean, he was coy about his sexuality too in certain ways, but that was a lot more open to a lot of people than his religion, which was also tied up with his relationship to his mother, who lived with him until her death in New York. And he put a lot of money into the Byzantine Catholic Church down on Stuyvesant Square. For those familiar, down not too far from where I'm sitting, about 20 blocks south or 25 blocks south of here, at about 15th Street or so and 2nd Avenue. So he was a great benefactor of the Eastern Catholic tradition. So again, it's piety, right? He attended several mass several times a week at the Church of St. Vincent Ferrer, always weekday mass. He didn't really go to Sunday mass very much. He would show up for daily mass. He's very private about his piety, didn't talk a lot about his faith, but it was important to him. He helped out frequently at a homeless shelter in New York, again, very discreetly. And there are a lot of debates about this, right? So I read a biography of Warhol that came out last summer that was kind of dismissive of his religiosity, right? And I think a lot of art critics tend in this direction because his religious works tend to be later works, right? And how religion fits into his personal life, especially if you're someone who views religion primarily through the questions of morals or sexual ethics or something like this, right? He seems to be an unusual kind of Catholic. But this was very important to him. I mean, you see him here meeting Pope John Paul II. This is in the 1980s, again, rather late in his life. So he does have this late religious turn, which is going to be very relevant for our conversation. Sorry, just wanted to check time. So again, just getting into some things, right? He's a pop artist, right? I'm not going to go through all of this here, but he's using images from the popular culture. So here you have another famous pop artist, Roy Lichtenstein, right? A lot of the themes though are celebrity, irony, and appropriation, right? And the appropriation point is very important for the 10 punching bags, because as we'll note, right, Warhol is appropriating Leonardo's Last Supper, which he does for quite a number of works late in his life. And for anyone who's been to the Museum of Modern Art, when they display their large Last Supper, or went to the Whitney exhibition where they had several of his late Last Suppers, you see this. This was an important late appropriation. And so irony and appropriation are going to be very important, I think, for our consideration of the punching bags. But Warhol is a revolutionary pop artist, right? Of taking things like Brillo boxes, Campbell's soup cans, and making them into art without even doing too much to them. Really just drawing attention to them in a different context with a different kind of artistic gaze than we would have on them in the grocery store. Seeing them blown up in an art museum gives us a different perspective on them and a different perspective on how they figure into contemporary life. And you see the same thing here with Lichtenstein's use of comics. So here's an example of a couple of these things, which also gets into Warhol's coyness about his sexuality here, right? So this is his Superman from 1961, right? Where he's clearly using irony here around Puff, which was a derogatory term for gay men in this period, right? Warhol is clearly using this ironically, right, while also appropriating Superman, right, appropriating the figure of Superman, right, who is of course supposed to be this classic American heterosexual male, right, and here he's playing on the fact that this is right out of the comic, this Puff, right, the mighty Puff. So this kind of plays out a few of these themes in Warhol's work. So going back though to his religious work and to his religious themes, right? So he does draw quite a bit on icons. I'm going to not talk too much about this because we're not going to be talking so much about his portraits, but in a lot of his portraits he uses a lot of gold, a lot of backdrops, just like you see in icons. I'll talk about the gold Marilyn a little bit later because you can see that here in New York, right? But the Eastern Orthodox icons do have an important influence on his art, particularly on his portraits from the 70s. Again, going through a couple of other things from Warhol, this is a very relevant work of Warhol here, masks, becoming less relevant perhaps, but and something to tie him into another religious work, Repent and Sin No More. Again, you see that this theme kind of carries across. This is another late work, very different than the ones that we're going to really be owning in on. But, right, Warhol, especially in the 1980s, as he becomes increasingly ill, his health was really never the same after he was shot in the late 1960s at his studio at Union Square. His work takes a real turn toward the religious that we're going to be exploring. And you see here skulls too, right? He has this, he does have this kind of death obsession, right? So here is a skull with him in a Polaroid portrait of himself. He did come very close to dying, in fact, when he was shot. And this does become an important part of his work after that point. This is one of my favorite Warhol religious works. This juxtaposition of the Last Supper, which again, it's the same Last Supper juxtaposition that we have on the punching bag, juxtaposed with this advertisement for be a somebody with a body. And I think this is one of the most fascinating works of Catholic Eucharistic theological art in the last 50 years here, right? The Last Supper, the this is my body, right? Be a somebody with a body, right? This is really interesting juxtaposition for those who understand the context of what he's doing here, the way he is bringing these works together. So again, and continuing to use irony too in some of these works. So let's shift to Basquiat for a few minutes before we kind of bring them back together to talk about the punching bags. So Basquiat is born in Brooklyn. He's from a Haitian and Puerto Rican family, right? He is raised Catholic. He does have a Catholic upbringing. It's usually not treated as central to his work as it is to Warhol's, as much as it even is treated as central to Warhol's. But there's a bigger literature on Warhol's Catholic upbringing and imagination than there is for Basquiat at the moment. His artistic sensibilities, this is a self-portrait by Basquiat, by the way, evoked street art, right? They also connected to the rise of graffiti in 1970s and 80s New York. So they just had an exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston called Basquiat and the Hip Hop Generation, right? Which was playing on this, right? The connection between art, culture, and music in New York City, right? In the Black and Hispanic community, right? In this period. So again, with graffiti art, with art graffiti on the subway trains, all different kinds of things, right? That all kind of connect together around similar themes and styles. He's also part of the Nuyorican art movement, right? He worked downtown in the East Village and Lower East Side, where that movement was centered. And I'll show later the plaque on his studio down there on Great Jones Street. And Warhol takes an interest in Basquiat's work. So Basquiat's work. So Warhol, by the late 1970s, has become very wealthy off of his art. Warhol, even through the mid 60s, right, wasn't making that much money. But then as the factory becomes kind of really a factory in terms of putting out a lot of prints of some of his most famous works, Campbell's soup cans, things like this, Warhol starts to make quite a bit of money and doesn't spend all that much of it on himself. And so he takes an interest in Basquiat and becomes a major funder and collaborator. So he loans studio space to Basquiat, and as we'll see, right, does get involved with collaborating with him on some artwork. Basquiat dies of a heroin overdose at age 27 in 1988, not that long after Warhol. And this is because, in a lot of ways, Warhol was a stabilizing influence in Basquiat's life. So he was somebody, again, who was providing money, who was providing kind of structure. And Warhol also was someone who had been around a lot of scenes with drugs, but was not a particularly pronounced user of drugs himself, and was also a kind of parental influence, telling Basquiat, like, stay off of drugs. He had that role in his life. And so when he dies, the sorrow over his death, combined with not having that influence in his life, is one of the things that leads to the spiral toward his own death. So there is a real kind of deep connection between these two artists in the 1980s, right? Basquiat kind of inspiring Warhol, revivifying him a bit, right? Warhol was viewed in this period as kind of, been there, done that, right? His most important works had been 20 plus years ago. And really kind of inspires Warhol in this period. So picking out some religious themes in Basquiat's own art here. So we see here the crown of thorns, right? Sangre, corpus, right? So blood, body, right? So these kind of Catholic religious themes here. We see the Sacred Heart of Jesus here, right? So much like Warhol, Basquiat is incorporating a lot of ideas and themes from his Catholic upbringing into his art, with, again, a level of subtlety, right? It's not what you would call classically religious art, but it's art that's certainly evoking and being inspired by the Catholic imagination. We see this again over here, right, with the cross, right? The connection to Roman youth, right? This is his Three Pontificators, which is inspired by a painting of the three popes from the period of the Avignon papacy, when they were resolving all that, where there were 1.3 popes before they got a couple of them to step down. So Basquiat, like Warhol, is somebody who perhaps, with some distanciation, right, has an interest in Catholic themes, Catholic visual themes especially, and is bringing them to bear in his work, even independently of his Warhol collaborations. So shifting back to Warhol for a second. Shifting back to Warhol, I want to talk about the Last Supper series, because this is, for getting us back to the punching bags, this is a really important late series. And for those who have never seen any of the Last Suppers, they are very large. These are like works that take up an entire wall in an art museum. In fact, many museums would not have many rooms that could fit these. So this one you see with motorcycles, right? So he's bringing in pop ideas here of motorcycles, of price tags, of things, right? Well, juxtaposing it on a sketch of Leonardo's Last Supper. This is the one that the MoMA has, which is sadly not on display. If I may say so, the Museum of Modern Art, despite continuing to expand its galleries, sometimes does a fairly lousy job of displaying its important works. And this would be one of those cases. The last time I went there, which was a couple of years ago, but it was after the new galleries had opened. This was not on display, but some of their other important works, like Christina's World, were also not on display. So I don't know what to say to that. But again, you see the brand images juxtaposed here: Dove, GE, right? So the ironic kind of commentary on capitalism, on brands, juxtaposed on this work of religious art, one of the most famous such works in the world, right? There was a time when, many Catholic households especially had this hanging in their dining room. This one was at the Whitney retrospective a couple of years ago for anyone who went. This is the Camouflage Last Supper. So you have several renditions of the Last Supper with camouflage juxtaposed on top of them. And this one is huge. This one is bigger than the one at MoMA. The one at MoMA is big. This one is really big. This one it's a very large work. It was in a very large gallery when the Whitney had it. And again, you can think about what is he getting at with this, right? Is there a commentary on militarism here? But again, he's playing around a lot. Warhol repeated themes a lot in his work in general, and late in his life, he's repeating a lot of religious themes. And again, these are some of his last works, these Last Suppers. Probably the work of a man who knew he didn't have a lot of time left. Because again, Warhol's health had been in decline for 20 years after being shot. He was never in good health after he was shot, and particularly in the 1980s, he was not in good health. So here's another one, right, with these different kind of colors juxtaposed. So, and this one's less of a sketch. This one's actually more of a kind of almost a rubbing where you get a real, full sense of Leonardo's work, but again, being juxtaposed on it. Here is the one that was in the backdrop of our first picture with the punching bags, with pink juxtaposed on top of it. And you can also see that the work repeats. It flips over to a second, so you get the last few apostles over here twice. So again, repetition, but very simple, right? All he's doing is putting essentially a filter on, now like you would on Instagram or whatever. He's just putting a filter on the work and putting it in front of us that way. So this brings us back to the 10 punching bags, which I promised you to focus on, and which I do want to talk about for the remainder of our time. So the 10 punching bags, again, are a collaboration between Warhol and Basquiat. These were never displayed during their lifetime. So this is a work from, it was going to be displayed in 1986. So there was an exhibit in Milan for celebrating Leonardo. And so this was going to be displayed across the street from where the Last Supper is being displayed. That was where the exhibit was going to be. But for whatever reason, this did not work out. This was not displayed at that time. So it was never displayed during the lifetime of either artist. And it's a rather challenging work to display because it takes up a lot of room and it's object art, right? You can't just put it on a wall, right? And unlike a lot of object art, it's not small, it's quite large. It takes quite an operation to mount it properly. So again, this is object art. So it's playing on some of the origins of pop art in the work, for example, of Marcel Duchamp, right, whose famous work Fountain, right, is a urinal. So going back to kind of some of those roots of pop art, which were Duchamp is an extremely important influence on Warhol. For those, again, who went to the Whitney, right, they had at that exhibit some of Warhol's books, and there was a book on Basquiat there in the kind of collection of books, not on Basquiat, on Duchamp, in the collection of books of Warhol that they had out there. But the way that they divided up the work, so Warhol put the image onto the punching bags of the Last Supper, and then Basquiat did the arranging in terms of putting on the letters, the words, some of the kind of details, right? Those are all Basquiat's, and they're very characteristic of his work, right? So you see this little crown, right? If we go back to some of the slides we saw with Basquiat earlier, you would see a strong resemblance here. You also see this is a different display than the one I showed in the first slide. You see one of the other Last Suppers behind it here. So this is a work that displayed an exhibit that displayed one of the other Last Suppers of Warhol. But as we see, the most recurring word is judge, which raises interesting questions for us. Who's being judged? Who's doing the judging? And who's getting punched, right? Punching bags are meant to train boxers. And interestingly enough, Warhol and Basquiat had become interested in boxing in this period. So we're going to go back, but I just want to show you these two pictures. So this is Warhol and Basquiat in a posed picture with their boxing gloves on, right, punching one another. And here's another posed picture of the two of them, right? So this plays into this interest the two of them had in boxing. And again, with Warhol, you can see kind of the layers of irony behind this, right? This is a man who's in his 50s, right, and whose gay sexuality has always been an important part of his work, right? So you can see kind of the irony and transgression, right, of getting involved in something like boxing, right, in the way that he's doing that. So I have another detail here of the punching bags, just to let you see some of Basquiat's work on them in more detail. especially some of the judges on Jesus's face, right? And these are distinct punching bags from the one we saw at the beginning. But again, you see here he has a black eye, right? You have some of the sort of graffiti types of details here. You've got a word bubble, judge. And again, the crown, right, evokes the crown of thorns, also evokes Christ as king. So a lot of different layers, a lot of different ways to think about this work. So that's why I want to think now is about the layers of meaning of this work, right? What does a work like this mean, right? Is this blasphemous or sacrilegious, right? I remember some of my students the first time I taught this work thinking this is a little weird, right? Putting Jesus on a punching bag, right? And this is a class where we also watch The Last Temptation of Christ, right? So we have these discussions a few times about blasphemy, using religious imagery and themes like this in art. Can you do that? Is that okay within the kind of the realm, the Catholic imagination? Now, from an art critical perspective, the classic interpretation of this work is that it's about the work of the artist. So it's in fact, for that kind of art critical perspective, right? Thinking about how critics view the artists as punching bags, right? So it's Basquiat and Warhol saying, right, you like to, attack our work. You like to treat us as punching bags, right? And so this is how we're kind of addressing you as critics. And again, there's a long tradition of this, right? Of artists. You see this with athletes, right? You see this with politicians, right? Critiquing the media, critiquing the critics for attacking them, right? All you do is attack, right? Why don't you say anything good about our work, right? But so that is a way that this has been interpreted, right? It is a commentary by the two artists about the way that their own work gets criticized. And again, that is a valid reading of the work, right? Artworks have different layers where you can read them. And that's a valid surface reading of the work. I think, though, that the context of the Last Supper and bringing the passion of Jesus to bear on this, combined with the Catholic imagination of the two artists, suggests something deeper is going on. That they may want to also be evoking something about the idea of Jesus as punching bag, about the suffering of Jesus as, in some ways, our punching bag. And I want to get to a critique of an overly simplistic vision of this, but I think there may be something there in terms of what the two artists are evoking, right? Basquiat especially is very interested in suffering in his work. A lot of his work deals with themes around suffering, around violence, right? He has works dealing with police violence, right? Dealing with violence within communities, right? And given Basquiat's interest in violence, I think there's something to be said here for drawing our eye to the violence of the passion of Jesus with, even though it's the Last Supper, which is kind of the beginning of the passion. I think there is a way in which they are doing this. They are showing Jesus as punching bag, as somebody who, again, has classically been portrayed in Christian art as taking on suffering, as somebody who accepted suffering from humanity and for humanity. So that raises a question, that raises a broader theological question that I kind of want to pivot us to. And that's where my title, Whose Punching Bag, comes from. So I think this artwork really raises questions about the theology of atonement, right? What do we mean? What have Christians meant by the idea of atonement historically, and what should we mean, right? And this is really, what does it mean to say that Christ suffered for our sins? This is classic aphorism, right? It's comes out of the New Testament, right? But it has been interpreted in various ways, right? And we see this in the liturgies of Holy Week with the readings from the second part of Isaiah, right? Of, you know, Jesus as suffering servant, right? As somebody taking on our sins, right? As our infirmities that he bore, right? But, and since especially Saint Anselm, right, who wrote a famous work in the Middle Ages called Why God Became Man, right? A lot of people have focused on the idea that Jesus suffered to pay a ransom to God for our sins, that God was angry and dishonored by our sins, and that the ransom had to be repaid, and it could only be repaid by Jesus because he also was God and was also a human, right? It needed to be God and human to repay it. But in more recent years, this has raised questions theologically. If Jesus became our punching bag, does this mean we should do the same thing? Should we accept abuse from others because Jesus accepted abuse in the Passion narrative? This is something that a lot of Christians have been told, whether by preachers, whether by family members. This kind of theology has enabled a lot of abuse and has allowed people or convince people to accept a lot of abuse that they should not accept. And so I want to point us, by way of concluding the kind of substantive portion of my talk, to two thinkers who can help us rethink this work. So Elizabeth Johnson, who retired professor from Fordham, who was my teacher, wrote a book called Creation and the Cross a couple of years ago, which came out right around the time of her retirement. And she, in that book, is trying to reinterpret atonement and what the cross means in terms both of some of the themes I've just talked about, of something less destructive, something less focused on violence, and also in terms of the planet, right, in terms of ecological and creation themes. And she talks there about the suffering of Jesus as being an example of fidelity to his mission, right? That Jesus died because he was carrying out his mission. And she compares this to some of the missionaries who were killed in El Salvador in the 1970s and 80s, like Gene Donovan, right, who knew that they were likely to be killed for the work they were doing, but were not looking to be killed, right? We're not looking to suffer, and not feel they deserve to be killed or suffered, or think they were, doing any great good by being killed in and of itself. So as fidelity to his mission, rather than as blood sacrifice, rather than as having to pay something back to an angry God. The other theologian I'd like to, and for Johnson also, this points, and I think this is pretty important here during the Easter season to think about, points toward the centrality of the resurrection, right, which is the central reality of the Christian faith. That we, in thinking about the cross, thinking about the suffering of Jesus, right, we should be thinking about the resurrection primarily. James Allison makes the same points, right, that there's a danger with atonement theology of having a bloodthirsty image of God underemphasizing the resurrection. So I want to conclude just talking a little more about the punching bags. So bringing up these theologies of atonement, right, is not to critique the work or to critique what's underlying it. In fact, I think what Basquiat does for us in his contributions to this work is, right, undergird for us kind of the ugliness of violence, the ugliness of what judgment can do, right, of being placed under judgment can do to us, and our need to find more life-giving ways to express that and emphasize that. And the work also, again, by bringing together the Last Supper and the suffering of Jesus, the Paschal mystery, right, really in this Easter season, helps us reflect on the Paschal mystery that we're concluding our celebration of with Pentecost in a few days. So I think these works, which again have been interpreted by art critics as being about the artist and critics, or as being sort of irreverent or perhaps sacrilegious works, I think for our purposes can actually really help us reflect on these mysteries that we've been celebrating for the last 40 plus days, and we'll be probably, I guess, 47 days now, and we'll be concluding our reflections on in a few days. So just to conclude, for further exploration, right, Warhol and Basquiat both do have major footprints in New York, right? They both lived here for their entire life, for Basquiat, and for most of his life, 2/3 of his life for Warhol. I have here, this is, you can go down to Great Jones Street and see the plaque outside of Basquiat's studio, which was, as the plaque shows, owned by Warhol. You also see some modern art here critiquing our former president, which is interesting too. But in the spirit of, not really the style of Basquiat, but in the spirit of Basquiat's political work. And the gold Marilyn here from Andy Warhol is in the MoMA, and that is on display. That is one they will not put away. It's actually harder to see Basquiat in New York. That's one thing when I was preparing for this that I was thinking about, is where can you see Basquiat's work in New York? And unless an exhibition comes through, it can be a little surprisingly challenging. Much of the good Basquiat is on display in other cities like Los Angeles. But the one place that has a lot of it in New York, there is a exhibit right now at the New Museum that has a few pieces on display down in the Lower East Side. Soho Contemporary Art is a gallery that has had some, but I'm a little unclear as to whether they're open right now, whether for COVID or other reasons. But so for those looking to learn more, there are things to do here. And for anybody traveling through Pittsburgh anytime soon, there is an exhibit on Warhol and Basquiat, including the punching bags, which again are rarely displayed. I was at the Andy Warhol Museum, which owns them, a couple of years ago, and was disappointed that they were not on display. But that work will be on display in Pittsburgh from June 7th to September 20th for those heading that way. And the Warhol Museum is a nice little museum. It's right next to the baseball stadium. So you know, which is, I've never been to, I've walked by the stadium but never been there, but it's supposedly one of the best stadiums in baseball. So for anyone looking to go to Pittsburgh, that is something to check out, and they will have a book and such. And so I'm going to stop talking because I've talked a lot, and I've been excited and happy to share this with you, but I am interested if you have questions or reflections that you'd like to share.
Gosh.
That was really fascinating. I learned a lot I didn't know. So, questions, anybody for our presenter?
You know, I'm not at all familiar with the 10 punching bags. And when I first looked at it, I missed that it was the image of Christ from the Leonardo piece. And I immediately thought it was, I knew it was Christ, but I thought it was purpose built, because to me, it looked to be in such a suffering character. And I don't think of the Last Supper as it, I know it's the, you know, it's the intro to everything that's going to happen later, but I don't think of it in that way, as a suffering image of him in that meal. So when I first saw it, that when you first showed it to us, it was the suffering and the agony that just seemed to fit very well with Christ as a punching bag. You know, the face is exactly where you would be doing the punching if you were sparring with it, etc. So, you know, right from the start, it seemed to me that when you said how the critics looked at this in terms of the artists themselves or whatever, without reference to the religious side of it, if you will, I thought, how the hell did they do that? I mean, how could you miss that? You got, you know, it just seemed stunning to me, because it seems so powerful in terms of what we believe in and it as Christ and what he did. Anyway, it was fabulous. I really was very interested, but I'd love to see. Maybe I will go to Pittsburgh, because I would love to see all the stuff that was then done by Basquiat on those bags, and we could only see some of it. But
Yeah, it's really hard to capture detail in an image.
but that was marvelous. Thank you so much. So interesting. Wow.
Thank you, Alice.
Daniel, I have a question. So in terms of, you mentioned Elizabeth Johnson and
Mhm.
James Allison, and I know it was the French, I think Allison bases a lot of his work on René
René, yeah.
Girard,
Mhm.
and that whole idea of the scapegoat mechanism within society. And did the art previsage the theology? So, I mean, Richard Rohr will write a lot about the Franciscans and Bonaventure, that, Don Scotus, that whole school of Franciscan theology that says Jesus didn't come to change God's mind about us, but to change our mind about God in terms of what sacrifice means. Do you get the sense that this was an intuition that both Basquiat and Warhol were able to capture on canvas?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you for that. I think particularly, and again, this connects kind of to Alice's comment too, I think Basquiat's contribution is really heading in that direction. I mean, he's drawing out the suffering and making it contemporary, but he's also, I think, drawing out the tragedy of the suffering, right? That it's, I think we've had a tendency, especially in that sort of Anselmian atonement theology, right? I mean, look, the idea of glorying in the cross, right, is in the New Testament, right? But what that means plays out in different ways. And I think by kind of Basquiat is really kind of showing us the shame of suffering, right? And in a way that, again, does tie the Last Supper to the Paschal Mystery in a fuller way, or in a, it's tying together Holy Thursday and Good Friday at the very least, in a way that the original work by Leonardo might not. But I think he opens a way for us to think about that suffering in a way that isn't as in a way that naming it as suffering, and getting away from some of those kind of unhealthy tendencies for us to want to say, offer up your suffering, even if that's like really bad suffering. Because for Basquiat, it connects to his other works dealing with suffering from, racially based violence, right, and other kinds of suffering that clearly, like, we don't want those kinds of suffering to continue. We don't want to offer those up. We want those to stop. So I think pointing to the ugliness of suffering in that context is really helpful for us.
Basquiat, I mean, I think there was a movie by Julian Schnabel out a couple of years ago on his life, and his mother suffered from emotional or mental illness. Is that correct?
That's not something I've actually gotten too far into with this work yet. It's something this is my work on Basquiat here is actually the sort of newest part of this work. So I'm still kind of delving more deeply into some of that. But he did have, he did have a challenging upbringing in Brooklyn. There was a lot of, suffering in and around his family.
So it'd be something that he, not just from a theological or catechetical background, it was something he'd experienced very personally in his own life.
Yeah, and also in the community, right? So he did, they had an exhibit at the Guggenheim a couple of years ago about some of the work he did in response to police violence in the 1980s, right? And they were deliberately connecting it to contemporary Black Lives Matter ideas. And so this is something that he was thinking, it was a theme he was thinking about a lot in his art, and that he brings to bear in a way that, again, this is not as much in Warhol's work. Warhol's work is more ironic, right? He suffered a lot in his own life too, especially after he was shot. But he was somebody who didn't like to talk about that, right? And again, maybe that was some of like living with his very old-fashioned Catholic mother for most of his life, right? May have played into that. But he was somebody who, had plenty of physical suffering, especially in his own life, as somebody who had been very sickly even in his youth, and especially after he was shot, was never really well again. But I think he would have tended to kind of like avoid showing any weakness or avoid doing that, whereas Basquiat was able to bring that to the fore much more.
In Eastern Catholic religious iconography, the cross is not really all that prominent, correct?
No, I mean it shows up in icons, but it's very like it's very it certainly doesn't take on the resonance around suffering that it does in Western art in the later Middle Ages. It's very like it's more of the glorying in the cross as a symbol of triumph. That would be more central there, because there's more of a centrality of Christ as kind of Pantocrator, as judge, as ruler of the cosmos, than as suffering servant, at least in visual art.
Would that have any connection to judge being written all over the piece, the punching bag piece?
Probably not directly, because I think that was all Basquiat, but it is an interesting point to connect back to Warhol's childhood and his own religiosity.
I was going to ask about the repetition of judge throughout as well. I mean, what are the thoughts on what's being said there? I was so struck by the portrait of Jesus on a punching bag that it took me a while to realize that the word judge was everywhere as well. And what are the thoughts on what that means, or why that's there, or who are the judges, and what is it? What's that about?
Well, see, again, if you take the art critic version of it, it's just like, these critics are always judging my art, right? I mean, that's,
Yeah.
And again, it is a conveniently self-referential interpretation of the work for an art critic. But it's not necessarily, but it's a totally valid one. And it, artists do care about this. I think from what we're thinking about, though, from the perspective of the Catholic imagination, there is again that sort of irony here, right? Because Jesus is both someone who is a judge, right, and who is judged, right? He is under judgment. He is judged by Pilate, right? He undergoes a trial. He is judged. He is sentenced to death, but yet he's also someone who, is set as a judge in Christian theology, and someone who said, judge not lest ye be judged, right? Someone whose teachings are interested in this question of judgment and when you should do it and when you're entitled to do it. And he's the one person entitled to do it.
Cool.
So again, there is some irony going on there, which I think, again, Basquiat is not as ironic as Warhol, but I think that would have been apparent to him that there's some irony there.
I think it was the idea of irony in the Last Supper paintings that Warhol did that really caught my imagination. And the one that I really kind of got stuck on was the one with the logo for Dove in the Last Supper. Because, okay, even with my limited abilities, I could figure out why the dove would fit there in the Last Supper. But I'm stuck with GE, and I'm thinking back then the logo for GE was we bring good things to light. And then Bhopal happened, and like GE was decimated in terms of PR. So I was wondering where in the timeline of GE this was painted in that, or why GE was in there.
I mean,
And what he was saying.
Well, I mean, this was the period when GE was one of the, like, this was the Jack Welch era of GE as one of the top, companies. I mean, again, this is an ironic Sacred Heart connection, because now their former corporate headquarters, which is one of the most lavish 80s corporate headquarters, is now part of our campus. So our business dean now uses Jack Welch's old office. So yeah, I mean, I think on that one, I think that we bring good things to life. I think that there's a lot to say there. But again, I think he's taking these sort of like dominant, corporate logos and juxtaposing them on Jesus and asking us to think about, how do these things connect? How do they not connect?
Yeah.
Right. Again, this was one of the most powerful companies in that period. Is that something that makes sense here? Is this sacrilegious? Or, as you say, is he asking us to think about bringing good things to life? The person who did a lot with the kind of disciple of Warhol, who did a lot with corporate slogans the way you're talking about, is somebody else I teach in my class, Sister Karita Kent.
Oh, yeah.
So Karita, who started out as a sister, is very, it's, speaking of irony, so there's really a rich irony in that, Karita, right, is a sister in the 1960s, right, and becomes famous for doing all this very religious art, and ends up leaving the convent and leaving the church, right? So she dies. She's not, she's no longer affiliated with Catholicism when she dies. Dies young. She dies before Warhol does, cancer. And so, whereas, Warhol, who's this very secular New York, for most people not very religious, he, dies a Catholic and has a funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Right. So there's really an interesting irony in those two pop artists and their Catholic journeys. But Karita does a lot in her work with things like the slogans, like "We bring good things to life" is the kind of thing that she would just put right in the painting. So she has a lot of work. I'm trying to think of some of the ones she has from the 60s that really do this very directly.
She painted the Boston gas tanks on I-95 going up to Massachusetts.
Yes, that's her later style. Yeah, that's her later style. My students are always blown away by that. We always get some students from Boston in that class because we draw from New England. And I always get students who are blown away by the fact that she did that.
Yeah.
Well, I would really like to do a road trip out to Pittsburgh, St. Francis Folk, because I love that museum. I mean, it's a former factory building, and so it's big for one artist. I mean, when do you ever get a chance to do that? To go floor by floor by floor for a single artist? It's just, it's just fascinating.
Well, that's where he spent his money on himself, right? Because that was all with money that he left.
I did work with Brendan Gill, who was his executor. And there was a lot of that that went on after he died.
Yeah.
But it pays off though. It's like the Frick, the Frick Museum is just a fabulous place to go. And now there was a real son of a bitch. I mean,
Andy Warhol is a much more relatable guy than Henry Clay Frick.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a wonderful museum. It's really worth going to. And then of course, does have a ballpark next door, but it's only the National League, so who cares?
Okay, well then, before we segue over to baseball, Daniel, we want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, from your apartment in Manhattan to our places all over the city and up north. I know that you did a great job tonight, because the first time we looked at the punching bags, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. And the last time I looked at them, I was so much more comfortable, and I could put myself in the story. So thank you so much. Your students are very lucky to have you.
Ugh,
And
Thank
Thank
you. I
we're lucky
appreciate it.
that you shared your story with us tonight.
No,
So
thank you very
Thanks so
much.
much.
Yeah, no, thank you
Thank
for
you,
your
Lois
attention
and
and your great
Alice.
questions.
Tom and Phil, and we'll see each other soon.
Thank you,
Amazing.
Jane. Thank you, Daniel.
All right, have a
Thank
great
you.
night.
Thanks
You
so
too.
much.
Thank you.
Bye, Tom.
Bye.
Bye, Lois.